Hello, everybody. I'm Joe Joseph, and this is your daily news brief brought to you by thedailysheeple.com. And I got some great, well, not so great news, but kind of not unexpected news, especially on the election front. Less than 2 weeks to go in this selection process. Yes. It's kind of interesting. This is kind of like a double whammy in the month of November. A good friend of mine and co-host of the Freedom Link radio program that I do, Johnny King. One of his favorite times of year is November. Why? Because you have Black Friday, which to him he affectionately calls the running of the Sheeple. It's like his Super Bowl. And he gets like a double whammy this year in that he's got the presidential elections, the most unbelievable, the most chaotic and corrupt and just bizarre election cycle that has probably ever been witnessed. And then a couple weeks later, he's got the running of the Sheeple. So it's amazing. But in all of the early voting that's been going on, according to SHTFplan.com, they mirrored an article today by our good friend Michael Snyder over at the Economics Collapse blog entitled, Electronic Voting Machines Caught Switching Trump Votes to Hillary, Trying to Steal Texas. That's kind of interesting. Mac Salvo put a little editor's note in there. He said, in particular with electronic voting, the opportunity to flip votes and steal elections is almost unstoppable and will be very difficult to hold accountable. Nonetheless, that is exactly what activists in Texas and other key states should focus on. Because after decades of solid red state status, they are now talking openly about Hillary winning the Lone Star State and flipping it blue, despite being perhaps the most despised, unlikable, and untrustworthy president or presidential candidate in modern history. And so, you know, these are really dangerous times. And the establishment is pulling out all the stops. That's not to say they haven't done it before, but see, now alt media is on this like they've never been before, because we have a better understanding now of how this corruption, how the cheating, how the crookedness of the whole situation, how it all operates. We know this now. And so we can keep our eyes on it. Also, people that are going to vote know what to pay attention for. Again, I can't stress this enough. If you have not seen this documentary, please, please, please watch it now. That is blackboxvoting.org's and HBO, their production, Hacking Democracy. Bev Harris went well above and beyond to go and expose the corruption with regards to the Diebold voting machines and just how easy it was to manipulate the vote. And, of course, it's gone on since then. They've never fixed the glitch. And it's just going on with greater, just reckless abandon at this point. Michael Snyder writes, is the 2016 election in the process of being stolen? Just a few weeks ago, he said he issued a major alert warning that this exact sort of thing might actually happen. Early voting has already begun in many states, and a number of voters in Texas are reporting that voting machines switched their votes from Donald Trump to Hillary Clinton. The odd thing is that none of the other choices were affected when these individuals attempted to vote for a straight Republican ticket. If Hillary Clinton is declared the winner of the state of Texas on election night, a full investigation of these voting machines should be conducted because there's no way that Donald Trump should lose that state. Let me stop there. He's right. The only problem is that it's very hard to verify the fraud unless you have the election tapes, the actual printed out tapes, right after that. That's one thing that Bev Harris had pointed out in her documentary. The other thing is according to Clint Curtis, a programmer that also was tasked years ago when these voting machines first came out to write code to manipulate the vote. He said, too, that there's no record. There's no trace of it. That once it's done, it's done. You can flip anything 51 to 49. You're done. It's amazing. He says most Americans don't realize this, but the exact same thing is happening and has happened during the last presidential election. The state of Ohio is considered to be the key to Mitt Romney's chance of winning 2012's election. And right up to the election day, the Romney campaign actually believed that they were going to win that state. But you never know. I mean, these voting machines, you can't, there's what kind of checks and balances do you have? You know, that's why I say this is a selection process. You know, the other thing is, I would be very careful about just blindly saying, well, Trump's my man. Trump's my man. If he can't do it, no one can. Trump, he says a lot of good stuff. But when it comes to things that are very important, especially to a lot of American people, when it comes to, say, justice, he's not exactly batting 1,000. And I want to bring up this Washington Times article real quick. This is kind of like a flashback where Donald Trump was talking about Edward Snowden. And he said, kill the traitor. Now, I don't know about you, but what Edward Snowden did was anything short. It was nothing. There was nothing traitorous about it. There was no treason involved. What Edward Snowden did was did his duty as an American citizen to expose unjust things that were going on, perpetrated by the government on the American people, spying like it's never been before. And not just the American people, on our own friends over in other countries. This article says, Edward Snowden, the man at the heart of the NSA information leaks, is nothing but a traitor, and America ought to recreate history in dealing with him, said real estate mogul Donald Trump on a Fox and Friends interview. In other words, execute him, said Mr. Trump. He says, I think Snowden is a terrible threat. I think he's a terrible traitor. And you know what we used to do? What we used to do in the good old days when we were a strong country. You know what we used to do to traitors, right? And Eric Bolling, the host, said, well, you killed them, Donald. And Mr. Trump said, well, he's damaging America. Is he? What damage came as a result of Snowden's leaks? That's the question that we have to ask. Don't buy into the rhetoric, but understand that Mr. Trump his judgment is clouded by a lot of the things that the powers that shouldn't be push. Even though he may be independent from all the funding and everything like that, that's a very dangerous mindset. If he comes and says, well, I'm all about the Constitution, right? And my government, I think it's part of his new contract that he put out with the American people, that the government has to be and abide by the Constitution. Well, if that's the case, then the NSA spying and all that stops tomorrow. How many people in this country have died as a result of a terrorist attack? And how many people have died as a result of a bee sting? You'll find out that bees kill infinitely more people than terrorists. Yet bees are still legal. Bees aren't hunted down and executed. Well, I guess they kind of are. If you talk about like Monsanto and all of their lovely chemicals that they use, you know, with their genetically modified foods, killing the bees, chemtrails, killing the bees. Maybe that's what it is. Maybe that's a covert operation to kill the bees because they kill more people than they do than terrorists do. I don't know. Could be. But Donald Trump also has some very, very concerning stances on some things that are not in line with his contract that he's put out. So be very careful about falling for the propaganda. And remember, too, that when you go and participate in this charade of an election, you're part of the problem. I know a lot of people say, well, if you don't go vote, you're part of the problem. Go check out George Carlin. YouTube, George Carlin and voting. And just watch that clip. And then you'll understand where my mindset is, because he and I think a lot alike in that regard. If you want to fix the problem, Don't feed into the beast. Don't feed into the problem. Come up with an alternative solution outside that problem, outside that cycle, if you will. And it's just getting worse. Britain, according to the Daily Mirror, just sent hundreds of soldiers and tanks to the Russian border in the biggest military deployment since the Cold War. Isn't that interesting? You know, the powers that shouldn't be are going all out. Nationalism is really a mindset that has taken hold in a lot of countries over in Europe and over in America. Why? Because, in a way, the powers that shouldn't be want you to feel that. Now, they'll say that they don't want you to feel that way, but they're pushing you that way. They're pushing you that way. This is psychology 101. They want you to feel this way. Why? Well, if they can push a war, they tend to profit. They'll get their way. They'll get what they want. If they don't get their war and globalism keeps going, why, they get their way. You see, it doesn't matter. They win either way. It's the way it works. But there's nothing good with Great Britain sending 800 troops, drones, and tanks to Estonia to also complement the Marines that are going, the U.S. Marines and equipment that are going and parking their tuchus right on the Russian border. And then we get mad when Russia deploys its fleet to Syria. I mean, I just don't understand it, you know? During the Cuban Missile Crisis, we got bent out of shape that they were putting missiles on Cuba. And here we are doing exactly what they did. And Russia doesn't have a right to get pissed? I'd be pissed. It doesn't matter if Putin's authoritarian or you may not agree with the way he handles things. The Russian people are human beings. Just like us. You know, they're not bad people. And we shouldn't be tolerating this type of behavior from our governments, no matter where you live. It's up to us to be able to push back and say, this is BS. We have no business going over there, let alone parking military equipment over in their territory, in some way telling them how to live their lives and conduct their business. Who the hell do we think we are? And just because it's the control freaks in Washington and the World Bank and the UN and whatever other organizations, the Bilderberg Group, the Trilateral Commission, the Club of Rome, it doesn't matter who it is. They're doing it in our name. And if we remain silent, then we're complicit. And we can't remain silent. And Russia's doing things, you know, they're hedging their bets. They just tested a nuclear-capable warhead, according to the Daily Sheeple, that can outsmart U.S. anti-missile systems. Well, of course. I mean, they have to. It's about survivability at this point. Look at what they're up against. What was Gaddafi up against? What was Saddam Hussein up against? You know, what was Afghanistan up against? They didn't want to play ball with the Western banking syndicate, and they got taken out. That's what happens. Brandon Smith of altmarket.com, his article was mirrored by the Activist Post. It says, the dark agenda behind globalism and open borders. There's a huge agenda behind this. He says, when people unfamiliar with the liberty movement stumble onto this undeniable fact of the conspiracy of globalism, they tend to look for easy answers to understand what it is and why it exists. Most people today have been conditioned to perceive events from a misinterpreted standpoint of Occam's razor. They wrongly assume that the simplest explanation is probably the right one. In fact, that's not what Occam's razor states. Instead, to summarize, it states that the simplest explanation, given the evidence at hand, is probably the right explanation. It's been well known and documented for decades that the push for globalism is a deliberate and focused effort on the part of a select elite, international financiers, central bankers, political leaders, and the numerous members of exclusive think tanks. They often openly admit their goals for total globalization in their own publications, perhaps believing that the uneducated commoners would never read them anyway. Carol Quigley, mentor to Bill Clinton and member of the Council on Foreign Relations, is often quoted with open admissions to this general scheme. He said this, quote, and this is from Tragedy and Hope: "The powers of financial capitalism had a far-reaching aim, nothing less than to create a world system of financial control in private hands, able to dominate the political systems of each country and the economy of the world as a whole. The system was to be controlled in a feudalist fashion from the central banks of the world, acting in concert by secret agreements arrived at in frequent meetings and conferences. The apex of the systems was to be the Bank for International Settlements in Basel, Switzerland, a private bank owned and controlled by the world's central banks, which were themselves private corporations. Each central bank sought to dominate its government by its ability to control treasury loans, to manipulate foreign exchanges, to influence the level of economic activity in the country, and to influence cooperative politicians by subsequent economic reward in the business world. This is how it works. And if they can't get their way, they're going to take it down." It's very simple. You can go back to the Bolshevik Revolution and see how it goes. You can look at Woodrow Wilson and the creation of the Federal Reserve. He said this in 1916 after the Federal Reserve Act was passed. It was passed 3 years prior to that. He said, "I'm a most unhappy man. I have unwittingly ruined my country. A great industrial nation is controlled by its system of credit. Our system of credit is concentrated. The growth of the nation, therefore, and all of our activities are in the hands of a few men. We have come to be one of the worst ruled, one of the most completely controlled and dominated governments in the civilized world. No longer a government by free opinion, no longer a government by conviction and the vote of the majority, but a government by the opinion and duress of a small group of dominant men." That was in 1916. And still we haven't learned our lesson. In 1920, even Winston Churchill, a young Winston Churchill, spoke about the connections between the powers that shouldn't be in the Bolshevik Revolution. This is what he said in 1920. He said, "From the days of Spartacus Weishaupt to those of Karl Marx, to those of Trotsky, Bela Kuhn, Rosa Luxemburg, and Emma Goldman, this worldwide conspiracy for the overthrow of civilization and for the reconstitution of society on the basis of arrested development, of envious malevolence, and impossible equality has been steadily growing. It played a definite, recognizable role in the tragedy of the French Revolution. It's been the mainspring of every subversive movement during the 19th century, and now at last, this band of extraordinary personalities from the underworld of the great cities of Europe and America have gripped the Russian people by the hair on their heads and have become practically the undisputed masters of that enormous empire." It hasn't changed. Central banks still run the show. And the central banks answer to the control freaks. And the control freaks are that small group of dominant men that Woodrow Wilson talked about. Same thing, just different times. Nothing's changed. Again, the way that we have to change this is to break free of this cycle that we're in. And that's all it is. If they don't get their way, here comes war. If they don't, look at, there is a huge populist uprising going on throughout Europe and throughout the United States. And even down in Venezuela and South America, Brazil, and Venezuela, huge. If they can't get their way, they will implode things. And when they implode things, it's going to go either, well, one of two ways is your primary means: economic, or it's going to be war. Or maybe they'll just do civil unrest. Because if Trump wins, you're going to get civil unrest. Black Lives Matter is going to go crazy. All these Soros-funded groups are going to go crazy. And you're going to have riots. If Clinton wins, you're going to have a bunch of pissed off people that says the election was thrown. Of course it's thrown. You think there's a legitimate election in the United States, you're delusional. It's just not happening. My good friend Popeye over at federaljack.com has a great quote, and I'll end it with this. The solutions to our problem is an inside job. We have to look within to find that solution. And we have to break free of these cycles that we're stuck in and free ourselves from these bonds. That's the only way we can do it. And to do that, we got to come together. No more playing into the divide and conquer tactics. Let's come together as human beings and love one another and respect each other. And maybe then, we can actually see change for the better. I'm Joe Joseph. This was your Daily News Brief brought to you by thedailysheeple.com. Subscribe to this YouTube channel today, The Daily Sheeple, and I will see you tomorrow. Have a good day, everybody.